On October 17th, 1989, I sat down after dinner to watch the third game of the World Series. It was a contest between Bay Area rivals, the Oakland Athletics and the San Francisco Giants. Al Michaels was making his familiar pregame banter with the man who was working with the color man. But all of a sudden, you heard him say, "What was that?" And then you saw it. The camera began to shake. It wasn't because someone hit the camera. It was because there was an earthquake. Suddenly, you saw players run out onto the field looking for their families, gathering together, getting off of the turf as fast as they could, going through tunnels, and getting out of the stadium. They would try to drive home, but the Bay Area Bridge was completely shut down because it had collapsed, and dozens had died in the rubble. We don't think much about earthquakes unless you live there, but we don't like the feeling of being shaken. We don't like the sense that somehow the ground moves underneath our feet. But faith, some people have faith and can really be shaken. There are people their faith is based upon the things working as they should. And so when death enters the situation, the death of a loved one, their faith shatters. Some have believed that their job and their identity are together, and so when a pink slip comes, they no longer are a human being, and their faith comes apart. For some, it's just basic disappointments in life. People who have decided to say, if this is how life works, I don't want any part of this. But today we'd like to come meet a church that had unshakable Christians because it was an unshakable church. So today, let's go down the road to a small, insignificant town, hardly ever mentioned anywhere, and meet the church that meets in Philadelphia. It's an unshaken church. Philadelphia was the youngest of the 7 cities of Asia that the churches reside in the book of Revelation. In 146 BC, Attalus II of Philadelphus of Pergamum, the king of Pergamum, founded the city with a single goal, and that goal was to make it a permeating center of Greek culture. And he was wildly successful, for within a generation, they had forgotten their native language and only spoke Greek. And it was planted in a place that could not have been any better for a place that was going to have as the hub of radiating spokes of culture. It was at the crossroads of the approaches of Mysia to the north, Lydia to the west, and Phrygia to the south. They called it the Gateway of the East, but it was well inland, far away from the coast. Wasn't on any major rivers. The Romans didn't bother putting an outpost there, and so it was a sleepy little town that didn't seem to equate to much. Those who went there passed through. Goods would move through at a crossroads and as a hub, but it didn't have all the trappings of an Ephesus or a Sardis. It was different, but it was different in another way. Its big problem was earthquakes. Every few years, an earthquake would rock the town of Philadelphia. Houses would be completely destroyed. The marketplace would be emptied. People would run to the countrysides. And there they would stay for days in tents. And perhaps they would come back and rebuild, but many never did return. They stayed outside the city all the time and only came in to do business. It was one of those places that you didn't know if you were going to be safe or not. It was going to have that kind of feel to it. And so you had a lot of ruins. And today, about the only thing left of the city is a wall that was jagged apart in another earthquake. And earthquakes would come quite often. They would come on a regularity, it seemed like. And so the town was constantly being destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed and rebuilt. But one of the assets of the town was the fertile soil. Somehow, with the earthquakes opening up, there was always some sort of a soil dispersion, and it became the perfect soil for growing grapes. And Philadelphia was known for very few things except for the wine that came out of the region. And for that reason, they built a temple to the Roman god Dionysus, the god of wine, and it fit their personality quite well. But in terms of a church and a place that we think of, it never measured up to Ephesus or Corinth or Philippi. It was just a sleepy little town. And the church was unremarkable, except in one way. If you just listen to what is said in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 8, it says, I know you have little strength. Now, we're not sure exactly what all that entails, but it was probably small, not very many in number. It was probably poor, not very wealthy. It didn't have the upper class of society in it. And they appeared to be kind of helpless. Not because they were weak necessarily, but because they were the targets of everyone in town. But what made them so remarkable in an unremarkable place was they had an unshakable faith. You listen to what Jesus says to them there in verse 8. He says, I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. They may be poor and small and helpless, but they've kept the faith. The word that appears in verse 8 is a word which means to watch. They were unlike Sardis, who didn't pay attention, who didn't look out for their faith, who did not nurture the things of their life. They slept through the things that they needed to stay awake for. And the second thing says, they did not deny my name. It's been the perennial problem through all the churches that they come up against this Roman obsession with the worship of Caesar. And you have one Lord and one Lord only. If it wasn't Caesar, your life was in peril. Goods could be confiscated. Your name could be smeared. Your neighbors would become your rivals and enemies. And apparently that has happened. And yet, when forced to choose between life and faith, they chose faith. It's a marvelous testimony to these people. They have so little to have. They have so little in the first place, and yet they will hold on to the one thing they do have: their faith in Christ. These are all tenses in Greek called aorists, and an aorist tense simply means it took place in the past, and it tends to point to specific instances. One of the things that this letter tells us in kind of a subtle way is this was their history, a common history, these events that kept taking place in the past, these times in which they were persecuted and they did not deny the faith, these times when they could have let their guard down and they didn't. They kept doing that in the past. All of these events, we don't know what they were. We don't know the specifics of them. But in one small way of putting it, Jesus says, I know every moment of your life that has caused you harm. I know what you did. And they kept up their faith. They kept up their life. In Eastern Tennessee, there is a race called the 100-mile Barclay Marathons. It is a 100-mile foot race, and it is brutal. Runners are given only two things: a compass and a map. There is not a marked out course, only a starting line and a finish line. And it's up to them to find their way to the finish line. And on top of that, there are no medical aid stations. If you get hurt, you get hurt. There's no one to mend your blister or to take care of a bruise. You either quit or you keep going. In the 30 years that it's been run, 1,100 runners have started those races in total. And over those 30 years of running that race. Only 40 have ever finished it. That describes pretty much the church in Philadelphia. While others gave up quickly, while others yielded their faith so gently and so perfectly that they wanted to preserve their life and their health, when they wanted their comforts, Philadelphia kept running. Through every problem, through every difficulty, through every threat, they kept going. And their source of their troubles was, as it was in Smyrna, the Jews. We're told in verse 9, I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars. He tells you exactly where their biggest problems come. We don't know what the Jews' problem was, but the Jews thought of themselves as God's chosen people, and that was an exclusive term. No one else could be. You had to be in our club, if you will. And they felt like they were special, privileged. And you could almost understand what they were saying. Here they were, proud believers in the one and only God. Then here comes these Christians who say they believe the same God, but then they worship another as well, a man named Jesus. How can you say you believe in one God when you have two? And it could be that in their privilege, they require these poor, helpless believers to bow before them when they spoke to the almighty and pompous Jews. Jesus took note of the Jews. He says they're liars. They're not telling the truth. And through all of this, through the persecution, perhaps the Roman government, but from the humiliation provided by the Jews, they kept going. Now, endurance is a hard thing. We don't understand it a lot. People can endure for a while. We used to get hold on in the best of circumstances, especially, and even a few times when it gets difficult. But real character gets shown when steadfastness is demanded over time and in every circumstance, even when it gets worse. And too many people in life, when it's time for them to keep going, just quit, even though they're on the right path. For the Christians at Philadelphia, they were unshakable. They didn't quit. But they did this because they had an unshakable reason to keep going. You can find it in the very opening words of this letter. In verse 7, the preamble comes. To the angel of the church of Philadelphia, write, these are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. There were three pillars upon which they rested their endurance. The first, God is holy, and so should they be. If they worshiped a God who was separate and distinct, who held himself above sin, who was revolted by the sense of wrongdoing, if they really believed in that God, then they must be the same. So somewhere in their life, in their heart, the God they served, this holy God they served, framed their life and gave them what they needed. The question we all have to ask is, what does your conception of God look like as it plays off in your life? There's some people who believe that God is tolerant or slovenly towards sin. He just doesn't care. He's apathetic. For these people, their endurance was based upon the fact that God is a holy God. The second thing it says is that God was genuine, so they serve him only. It says in this passage that God is holy and true. And the word true in Greek is the word for genuineness. A coin that was authentic and not a cheap replica was called true. And Paul would talk about this when he wrote to the Corinthians. He said, in 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 5, he said, "For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are, quote, many gods and many lords," he acknowledged the fact that in mankind, they put together a pantheon of gods. So many gods, they couldn't keep them all straight. And yet, what Revelation 3 and verse 7 says is the God of heaven, Jesus the Son, they are the genuine element. They are the real power. They are the real gods. So it must have been driving these people that when all of their neighbors were pagan, or the Jews had concocted an image of a God that was not really truly God, they said, but God, our God is genuine, and we will serve that one and none other. When you have that frame of reference, you can avoid denying the name of Christ. But the third was that God is powerful, and they followed him. He held the keys, it says. Those term keys are an interesting thing because they give you access to things. If you have a safety deposit box at the bank, they give you a key, and they keep a key. And as long as both keys are there, you can get into the safety deposit box. That's why it's safe. If someone is holding the key to keep someone else from getting it. And so it talks about the keys here. And it talks about the keys of Israel, the keys of David. And if you go back in the Old Testament, there was a time, the reign of Hezekiah in Isaiah chapter 22, that Hezekiah had a servant. His name was Eliakim. And Eliakim was what I would call a gatekeeper. Today, the President of the United States has a chief of staff, and the chief of staff is the one who allows access to the president. If he didn't, everybody would want to just waltz in. But he holds the keys in a sense. And Eliakim held the keys of Hezekiah's household. And so no one could just come see the king. No one could just drop in for a visit, if you will, without Eliakim letting them in. He held those keys. But God saw something in Eliakim that gave him a little greater power. In Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 22, God says, "I will place on his shoulder the king of the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut. And what he shuts, no one can open." Eliakim was given the trust by God to take care of the kingdom as he took care of Hezekiah. So it was with God. If God holds the power, you need to serve him. If God holds the keys to heaven and earth, if he holds the keys to events in which doors were open that no one can shut and doors that are shut that no one can open, doesn't it make sense that in all circumstances, no matter what they are, you pay attention to the one who gives you access to the heavenly places? The saints of Philadelphia, they knew a man who held the keys to the kingdom was a powerful man. So they obeyed God. And that God who held those keys had given them great opportunities. And he frames it that way. He goes on to say in verse 8, he said, "I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one could shut." Something happened. With the endurance and steadfastness of these Christians, it provided them an opportunity. The opportunity of witness. To show what faith really was like to an errant generation. Church history has taught us one simple thing. The times of the greatest growth of the church was in the greatest times of persecution. And what you could see was when these Christians suffered for their faith, when they lived it out in the worst possible circumstances, there were people who would scratch their head and say, what makes people like this die like this? And they could see there was more. There was deeper meaning to their lives than they ever had. So they began to ask questions. And so he says, I have set before you, I have opened this door that no one can shut, this opportunity to show the God that you serve. Because you see, the reason for their unshakable faith is it was placed in some, not for today, but for the tomorrows, the one who held the tomorrow. And because of that great unshakable endurance and that great unshakable God, they also received unshakable promises. The first promise is God would give them the assurance that their steadfastness was not going to be in vain. They weren't going to die as martyrs. They weren't going to die and be forgotten. Instead, in verse 11, Jesus says, I'm coming soon, so hold on to what you have and let no one take your crown. I'm coming soon. Now, the coming of Christ can either be viewed as a threat or a promise. It's a threat to those who are disobedient. The judgment of Christ when he comes will be destructive. But as a promise to those who believe and obey and are steadfast, it is the reward of a well-lived life. I am coming soon. Do not worry. I am coming, and this will end soon. We can usually stand something for a short period of time if we know there's an end. It says, make sure you hold on, grasp that faith that you have held so long. Hold it even tighter. Hold on to what you have so that the crown won't be taken from you. Perhaps we don't think much about our daily actions, but everything we do is affecting our eternity. If you think about Esau, for instance, Esau lost his birthright because he was nonchalant with it. He came home one day. He was hungry. His brother, Jacob, was fixing bean stew. And so he sold his destiny for the hunger of a stomach today. Was it worth it? Or take Saul the king. Saul had been given the great privilege of being the first king of Israel, chosen by the prophet, chosen by God. And yet for his own hubris and ego, God tore the kingdom from him. The promise, the assurance that their steadfastness is not in vain, is that Jesus will come and he will keep your crown if you will stay the faith. That's the assurance that the steadfast people have. The second great promise that was made is that God would deal with their enemies. The synagogue of Satan, that term that means the place where Satan's followers gather. In verse 9, he said, I'll make those who are the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews who are not, who are only in name only, but are liars. He says, I will make them come to you and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. There's a lot in that one sentence. There will be a reversal of fortunes. The Jews had always believed that they were so special that God would take care of them. And so it was when in the Old Testament They would be oppressed by their enemies. They would wonder what happened to God in all of this equation. Yet in Isaiah chapter 60, as he sees the end of Babylonian captivity, as in the middle of it, he says, understand, the children of your oppressors will come, bowing before you. All who despise you will bow down at your feet and will call you the city of the Lord, Zion of the Holy One of Israel. See, the promise made by Isaiah to the captives was, one day you will not be on the bottom looking up. You will be on the top, and people will come and they'll bow down before you. The great reversal of fortune. And sure enough, in the judgment day, the Jews who had been so haughty about how they were the special, perfect, precious people of God, the chosen people, those who do not recognize the truth of what God had been doing with his plan, they suddenly will find themselves bowing and seeing they were not all that special. In fact, they were the oppressors. So this is the promise, but it has some part to it. And they will acknowledge that I have loved you back on the plains of Moab before Israel entered the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy deals with the special problem of how to be God's people in a new place. And he addresses this issue that apparently the Jews there in Philadelphia had taken. That is, their specialness. And why were they so special? And Moses addresses that issue at the very beginning of their existence. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, he says, the Lord did not set his affection on you or choose you because you're more numerous than other peoples, for you are the fewest. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept to those that he swore to your ancestors when he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you in the land of slavery. God loved his people, but it had nothing to do with their sterling character. So the Jews must have thought, God loves us. He doesn't love you. And they have missed the point. One day, the Christians of Philadelphia, they will have to look and say, God has loved you and not us. They will have to acknowledge what they have refused to see for so many years. The great promise is that we will not always be where we are, and God will take care of this. The third promise is God will give them strength in problems. Verse 10 says, since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants. There's a lot of questions about that, the whole world. There is in Revelation chapter 6, it's the discussion of a great tribulation that will sweep across the world. It was going to be one of those things that would touch everybody of humanity. We're not sure exactly what that means, although there's some who want to go further than what the text says. But no matter what it is, when that moment comes, for these people who have endured so much and who must endure even more, God will give them the strength they need. He says this is going to be a test, and the word test means to basically determine which is genuine and which isn't. The greatest thing that suffering does is it really does explain who you really are. You may not like it, but it will tell you what your character is in ways that nothing else can. And the one who showed strength will receive even more strength. And we reveal ourselves as steadfast, God provides even more power to overcome. The strong become stronger, the way God puts it. You can hear the rumble of the earthquake in this passage. For the earthquakes, the whole town was destroyed, except the giant pillars that held the roofs of the temples. They stood and still remain standing to this day. There's this permanence that is there. And in Asia Minor especially, there were inscriptions on these pillars of the names of faithful priests who had served in that place. God says in the New Jerusalem, in the temple of God made of my people, I am going to put your name on that thing which will never move and never be destroyed. You'll never be forgotten, and you will have that kind of stability. The Christians at Philadelphia who knew about the temples that with their pillars and the shaking of the earth, they knew the metaphor, how much it meant to them, that they would be remembered, they will become stable, and they will become permanent in God's sight. But in the aftermath of the earthquake, one of the things it says in that passage, and they will never leave it, that temple, the aftermath was interesting because in every earthquake, people would flee for their lives. They wouldn't stay in the city. They wouldn't stay where they were. They would leave. He says, understand, when you become the pillar in my temple, people won't leave it. This is here to stay. And those who are faithful will continue to be with me constantly. And then the last promise, God's going to give them a new name. Verse 12, he says, and I will also write on them my new name. Now, we've met the concept of the new name before in the book of Revelation, but it probably has very special significance to these Christians because they lived in a town that had its name changed often. An earthquake in an early part of the first century destroyed Philadelphia. And Tiberius, the king of the Caesar, came in and he had it rebuilt. And to glorify his own kingdom, he changed the name from Philadelphia to Neo Caesarea, the new Caesars. And everybody had to get used to that name, and it was because they were now citizens of Neo Caesarea. Their identity had changed all of a sudden. Then 20 years before the letter of Revelation was written, the city had to be rebuilt again because of another terrible earthquake. But now it was named after the family of the Emperor Vespasian, who was the emperor at the time. And the new name of the city was Flavia, after the emperor's family name. And now they were all citizens of Flavia. Living in Philadelphia, you never really knew who you were because the name changed so often. But now, the possession, the citizenship, the identity of these Christians would not be with a city, but be with their God. The tragic thing for us is too many times we situate ourselves on earth and become citizens of the planet rather than citizens of the kingdom. The kingdom will not be destroyed, while political boundaries will change. Power structures will be destroyed and altered, and one day the world will be gone. But the kingdom, if you're a citizen of the kingdom, if you bear the name of God, you will never, never forget who you are. So Christ holds them up as the pattern. Here is the unshakable church with unshakable Christians. We have this letter, I think, because it tells us something about what we need, or at least we need to confront. Too many times we read Scripture as it is with fact and say, that's nice. But here are some principles. Here are the things that when you read these people, what are we like compared to them? Do you hold your promise under pressure? They were unshakable because they had vowed themselves to God at the very beginning, and they would not give up that promise no matter what came their way. They held fast and did not deny the name. Sometimes people, we are modern 21st century Christians, we're concerned about our comfort. And if we're uncomfortable, we complain. After all, we expect padded pews at church and ice cold air conditioning in July. And if you don't have it, we complain about it. And yet, here is this church that had all these problems, that had all the pressure put on it. And the whole time they held on to the faith and didn't give anything up. They were who they were, no matter what bad things happened to them. The question is, do we? Do we hold the same promise under pressure? How easy would it be to lose your grip on your faith? At what point would you say, I think I've had enough? Now, it's easy from a very hypothetical situation to say, it would never happen to me. When I was in college, the Soviet Union was roaring and going. At that time, I remember I hated this hypothetical question because it didn't make any sense. It said, if the Russians were to break in and say, are you a Christian? And they'd shoot you if you said yes, would you say you were a Christian? I didn't like the question because it was not real. It had not happened. It's too extreme. Because as I've grown older, I realize that we give up our faith under much less circumstances. I always like what Wilbur Reese wrote about modern Christianity in a little piece called $3 Worth of God. He says, I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough God to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. You see, Christianity costs us nothing, is worth nothing. And for these people at Philadelphia, they were paying a price every day for their faith because their faith was worth something to them. And you usually get what you pay for. So do you hold on to your promises under pressure? The second perspective is, do you know the why of your faith, not just the what of your faith? We tend to drill ourselves on what to believe. There's nothing wrong with that. We need the didactic teachings of doctrine and scripture. But the reason these people could hold on to their faith so well was because they knew the why of their faith. They knew the holy God. They knew the genuine God. They knew the powerful God. And they would hold on because of the God that they served, the why of their existence, not the going through the motions of how you do faith. They had the roots of their lives in those things, the why, to keep going. Hope Jaron is a science writer who specializes in plant sciences. And he describes what it takes to make a plant survive. As he writes, he says there's no risk that is more terrifying than that taken by the very first root. A lucky root will eventually find water, but its first job is to anchor. Once the first root is extended, the plant will never again enjoy any hope of relocating to a place less cold, less dry, or less dangerous. Indeed, it will face frost, drought, and greedy jaws without any possibility of flight. The most important part is the anchor of the fruit. And the most important part of our lives is the anchor of our faith. If you don't know the why of your faith, if you don't have that bedrock belief that no matter what happens, there's a holy God that expects holiness from us, that there is a genuine God who we worship exclusively, and that there's a powerful God that we follow him. If you don't have those whys, how can you hold on? That's what Philadelphia teaches us. So whatever happened to Philadelphia? Through all of these churches, some are happy stories and some aren't. This is an insignificant church in an unremarkable town. But as we've read today, they lived up to what Jesus told them to do. They endured. They held on. They were unshakable. And that tended to define them going forward. The 7th century AD, the Ottoman Turks swept across Asia Minor, and all the other cities fell except for Philadelphia. It held on. It was resistance. It didn't fall to the Muslims until the 14th century. And in that part of Turkey, Islam holds strong. It holds sway over every part of human existence in the area, except for Philadelphia, a modern city named Al-Shair. And there, in that town, spoken of in Revelation chapter 3, today, there are 1,000 people who name the name of Christ. Unshakable. The town may be in ruins, but the faith is alive. Is yours? Os Guinness tells a story about being at the deathbed of his good friend, the Christian writer and scholar, John Stott. The visit wore Stott out. His voice grew faint and hoarse. Stott finally turned his head, looked at his friend. And the last words he ever said to him were these: "Pray that I will be faithful to Jesus until my last breath." Those are wonderful last words that we need to have on our lips as well. Be unshakable.